Greetings, Minecrafters, and welcome to another Minecraft discussion. My name is Kimberly Quinn, and I'm ready to rock and roll today on talking about scorekeeping in relationships and why it's sort of best to try to avoid this if possible. I think we all fall into it, especially if you're talking about a romantic relationship and you've been together for a long time. It can be very easy to fall into, almost maybe not even aware of it, but it's really a good idea to kind of steer out of that. And my inspiration for today is Richard Carlson. I'm on a Richard Carlson jag. He is the author of Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and he's got a bunch of them. Don't Sweat the Small Stuff with Money, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. The very first one, I think, is that's what all it was. And then Don't Sweat the Small Stuff in Love, which is my inspiration today. So even though he's talking specifically about scorekeeping in romantic relationships, really, we can take his advice, in general, because it just doesn't, it's not something that feels good or goes anywhere good. And yet it's a really common habit I think we all can sink into at times. And, Richard is funny, I think. And another one I'd love to have lunch with. He starts out just kind of getting straight to the point. If you wanted an absolutely predictable, completely reliable way to guarantee ongoing frustration and a virtually guaranteed way to adversely affect your relationship, it would be to keep score of what you do and of what your partner isn't doing. Man, isn't that the truth? And if you really wanted to compound the problem, you could let your partner know on a regular basis how he or she isn't meeting your expectations and how much more you are doing than they are. I mean, that just definitely says it right there. I mean, yeah, God, my husband and I have been married forever, 30 something years. And I wouldn't say we do a lot of this, but even in our, gazillion year lovely marriage, you do fall into it sometimes. And the thing is, you fall into it because it's often true. So that's, the hard part. Like lately, I've had an issue with being the only dish doer, and I'm like, I said, look, just because I'm remote today, doesn't mean I'm everybody's bitch. Jeez, and then he'll laugh. But then when we think about it, we talked about it, he was right, because he's also the one who gets up in the morning, and it's winter now, starts the here in Vermont, starts the fires right when he gets up dutifully. And I knew this. I knew this. I was kind of just playing with him. We weren't actually having an argument, but I was feeling like the sole dish doer. I'm definitely the sole chef. I've been the sole chef our entire marriage. But then as you stop to think, yeah, he's the one doing the fires. He's also, this is, I mean, a super traditional role, but he's the garbage taker outer. And it really is, pretty even. But even if it weren't, though, when we do fall into this scorekeeping, like when I brought up the dishes the other day, it doesn't really go anywhere good. And thankfully ours just turned into a conversation. But certainly then there are times in a 30 plus year marriage where, especially if one of or both of us were sleep deprived and we had the kids, they were little and just got home with an infant, or something like that, it's easy to have it not be, just an amicable conversation, which ours was this week, but to really let it get a small thing can really snowball into a bigger thing when it's about, oh, I took the garbage out 3 weeks in a row. Well, so what? And there are ways to just, I mean, mostly the whole point of this conversation is to just let that go. But even if it is something super legit that's getting in the way of the relationship, then obviously it's good to have a conversation. Because when we are proactive and say, I've been noticing that da, 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 da," and it'd be really helpful if you wouldn't mind to, take out the garbage too, or take, alternate cleaning the bathroom. And what I'm thinking of, at our ages, we're in our seasoned late 50s, but this is definitely true and common, really common. I think when our young adults go away to college and they're with roommates, and you can be really fortunate when everybody's doing their share. And usually you start with just two people, and when you're first years, right? Maybe a third sometimes. Usually it's just two. By the time you're seniors, usually there's four people in the housing. And then it's a good idea to kind of come up with a plan so that's, people aren't getting kind of irritated and resentful. So Richard kind of taps into that, and then he goes on to say about there can be an overall breakdown of the otherwise positive relationship. So his thing is mostly about, the romantic relationship, but again, it's roommates. It could be siblings who are now roommates as young adults. It can also be, the young adults and parents and stuff. And obviously, in a nuclear family like that, you're going to probably tolerate it more than you would as non-familiar roommates. But still, it can really be prevented. It's an easy thing that we slide into because it's human. I did this 5 times and you did it 0 times, especially when it's a bathroom, because a bathroom is a bathroom. Taking out the garbage is not nearly as gross as cleaning a bathroom. So I think that's the one that's, last on the list for people. And often the one person, let's say in a roommate situation, who can't stand it ends up being the one who does it because she or he or they just can't stand it, and then they get resentful, blah 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 blah. Um, and then Richard said, for various reasons, it's tempting to keep track, either silently, which is usually what it is, right? Or even out loud, of all that you're doing to contribute to the relationship, I'm going to say, or roommate situation, to make your partner's life easier, and how much you sacrificed in the name of that relationship. And that's kind of what we fall into. Again, I'm just expanding Richard's take on this with a romantic relationship, because there's so many other ways this scorekeeping thing can happen. Or even if you're dating but not living together, but like maybe you just started dating and one's doing most of the date planning and the other one's maybe doing none. That still counts. And after a while you're like, what the heck? If I stepped out of this and stopped planning the movies and the lunches and the walks through Central Park, do we even have a relationship? It wears on you after a while. Um, and then he says, you think of how many times in a row you've cleaned the house or paid the bills or driven to work or done the laundry or bathed the children or whatever. So he says, perhaps we do this for fear we won't be appreciated, or maybe it's because we are slightly resentful of the role we find ourselves in, or perhaps it's something altogether different. But he says, whatever the reason is, it backfires. I also think it's important to acknowledge here, because we do a lot of talking about the ego, right? And ego being the evil twin of the authentic self. And some of the things Richard talks about, the need to be appreciated, when we find ourselves resentful, and if we kind of allow ourselves to cave into being the one doing the high majority of things, at least in our perspective, I think it's important, in addition to not, the part where we're talking about not scorekeeping, I think it's really important to look at our own behavior and why we're kind of allowing ourselves to take on that role in the first place. Because and blaming doesn't ever go anywhere good either. So even if we wanted to blame, we can only blame the other person so much, because we're also, it's a tango, right? Especially if we're talking about a romantic relationship. So if this has been going on for months and months and years, there's likely a pretty large dose of codependency there, where we're, sacrificing our own comfort, life minutes, and everything to make things easier for the partner. Because, and we can tell by how we feel, right? Because we've talked about this. There's mindful giving versus mindless giving. So with mindful giving, and but by how you feel. If we're mindfully surprising the partner with a beautiful dinner or breakfast in bed, or mindfully planning dates for the person we just started seeing, we're mindfully where you got a group of roommates in college or graduate school or out in the world or whatever, millennials, and you're working, and you mindfully bring in, get fresh cut flowers every couple of weeks for the house, and and you feel good about that. You feel charged up. You feel energized. Versus mindless giving, when we just are doing something out of an ego place, to look for the need for getting our self-esteem from doing good things, like becoming, instead of just authentically doing it without expecting anything back, without caring if we get any kudos, without caring about the appreciation. That's mindful giving. Mindless giving, we are scorekeeping when we're in the place of being ego driven, because that means we're getting resentful that people aren't appreciating. We're getting resentful that they're not doing their share. We're getting resentful that maybe they're not even noticing. And that's important, that I think that we look at. And that's me adding it in here, because I think that in order to, sort of arrive at a better place with scorekeeping in a relationship, we have to look at you know, the both sides of dancing the tango, I guess that's what I'm saying. And this next part that Richard talks about is important too, which we've talked a lot about in Minecraft. Is actually the foundation as far as in a general sense that we know for a fact that thoughts come first and feelings come second and actions or behavior last, right? So the thoughts we allow, and the word is allow, to stick, right? And if we also do that 17-second rule we talked about, if we really kind of let that resentful kind of talking. I've taken the garbage out 9 weeks in a row, or I've done the dishes for the last 3 weeks in a row. We allow that to continue to circle more than 17 seconds is even a tougher, uphill push to get it to stop, right? So Richard taps into this with the whole thought pattern thing, which I think is important. So he says when you engage in this extremely common habit, we're talking of scorekeeping, two things are certain. First, your excessive thinking about the perceived inequities in your relationship will frustrate you and stress you out. That is true. When you constantly remind yourself of your own hard work, you'll invariably feel angry at your partner, and in many cases, your loving feelings will diminish. This is very important. And again, if we want to reel in the roommates, and things. It's not the same level of love, but the consideration, the liking, those relationships will also diminish. It's all really not different. It's just maybe deeper and more committed with a romantic relationship, but the relationships of a roommate's relationships are still diminished. The connection between your thinking and the way you feel is undeniable. I'm glad Richard said that to support us because we've been talking about that for a very long time. As you think about your resentments and fill your mind with your unfair task load, you'll feel the effects of those burdensome thoughts. You'll feel taken advantage of and burned out. And I like that he touches on this for the reason that we were just saying a few moments ago, because what part of it has nothing to do with them not taking the garbage out for 9 weeks and allowing us to do it? Well, the fact that we're letting it circle through our heads, that toxic internal dialogue just going around and around, whether it's legit or not, we're allowing the hamster in the wheel thinking, all those thoughts to then lead to those feelings. If we're thinking resentful thoughts, they will inevitably feel to resentful feelings or angry feelings, or whatever it is we're talking about. That part's on us. We could have a conversation and be done with it. Um, but the fact that we're letting it just smolder, like, simmer on the back burner, is us. And I like Wayne Dyer talks about it a lot, right? He says, no one else can hurt your feelings. So we can change that from hurt feelings to offend you. No one else can hurt your feelings. No one else can make you angry. No one else, only because think about it, they're your feelings. No one else has control over your feelings. Only you have control over your feelings. It doesn't mean whatever they're doing isn't legitimate. It is. It might be, right? It might be or is. And it's on our end though with how we handle it is the ticket. So then Richard said in response to the partner relationship, or the romantic relationship example, he says, second, your partner will feel your resentment and built up tension, which will give him or her more negativity to latch on to and think about. So then your kind of hamster spinning around in the negative internal dialogue wheel will then trip their hamster spinning around a negative, internal dialogue wheel, and now you're both two hamsters spinning around in wheels that are going no place good. And he says, no one wants to feel as though their partner is put off and angered by the contributions they're making, or I'd say, or not making, right? In fact, the usual response to discovering this is to become defensive about how much he or she is doing in comparison. Both parties dig in and think even more about how much they are doing. Scorecards are flying. So then your scorecard kind of leaks into them keeping score, and it's a cycle. Negative feelings surround your relationship, and both partners think the other is to blame. And then we get into the shame blame cycle. And it just doesn't go anywhere. It just doesn't go anywhere good or healthy or positive. And the other thing I want to just add in here, just from being in a long term, just wonderful marriage. And I'm not saying anything's perfect. No one's relationship is. And certainly, if you're married for 30 plus years, you've had some firecracker moments too, no question. But what I want to say is that it's definitely not a great habit to sink into, scorekeeping. But and that said though, I don't know that we need any whistleblowing right off the bat, because if we're talking about a romantic relationship and maybe even a college relationship, I'm thinking more romantic relationship. There's a give and take, and it's not always even day to day. Sometimes somebody might be doing most of the giving when the other partner's having a rough time, and might be, 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 3 months of that person doing most of the giving, and then it flips and changes, and then it's the other partner doing more. It's rarely when you're in a long-term relationship is it 50-50 on a daily basis. It just doesn't work that way because life doesn't work that way. So I kind of wanted to just throw that in there. So, and then lastly, Richard says, a way to kind of turn this around, right? Because we always start in the podcast, we've got a topic, and then we talk about the whole middle and how, like, kind of like the issue at hand. And then the idea is to wind up on the hopefully as close to always as possible on a positive note with kind of how to turn it around, kind of like what to do. And so Richard says, as the scorecard enters your mind, see if you can drop those thoughts. See if you can drop those. I can just picture like drop the thoughts. Think of the thought bubbles like John Kabat-Zinn, just like pop, pop, pop. Think of, see if you can drop those thoughts and bring yourself back to a loving feeling. Remind yourself that it's easier to see your own contribution, that is true, than to take your partner's efforts, and to take your partner's efforts for granted. For the moment, reverse this process. Think not of what your partner isn't doing, but instead think of what he is doing. You may discover that some portion of your frustration isn't reality, but simply a mental habit that has crept into your thinking. Oh my gosh, I just absolutely love what he just said because we are all the authors, of our own script, the main actors on our own stage, right? So when we can really slow that down, we often do realize that since we've been thinking about it so much, the thoughts themselves just took on their own momentum, took on their own life. And that when we really stop to fact check a little bit, maybe we didn't take the garbage out 9 times in a row. Maybe even if it wasn't exactly even, he or she or they did take it out of, you know what I mean? Like, so it's really important to step out of that current a little bit. Um, where was I? Okay. And then each time you dismiss your this isn't fair thinking, you'll be contributing to the goodwill of your relationship. If we can pop that bubble, like John Kabat-Zinn says, pop these bubbles. I am not my thoughts. In fact, he talks about his wife, Chris. Chris and I have discovered that ultimately keeping your scorecard thinking to a minimum actually contributes to a loving relationship. To more of a loving relationship than any of the more concrete contributions you are making. I'm assuming like taking out the garbage anyway, doing the dishes like my little issue a couple weeks ago, and then the ones you were fretting about. So the whole thing is the idea of the whole don't sweat the small stuff. I think it's also important to say here because, and I've done other episodes on this, and I live my life this way that none of this is an emergency. Thank goodness life is not an emergency. And usually it's not even an urgency. God forbid when if somebody gets that phone call middle of the night, the state troopers are calling and it's some really bad accident or something. Thank God that is not the everyday. And not only is that not the everyday, life isn't even urgent most days, right? It just isn't. So to just think about, stop ourselves when we're in that, nip it in the bud is the fact that I took the garbage out, 5 more times than they did, she did, he did, whatever. We really can almost laugh at ourselves. Like this is not a crisis. It doesn't mean it's not that you're not right 5 times versus 2 times, but it's the garbage or it's the dishes. Just like my little thing the other day. It's thank God it's not a tumor. I think thinking of Arnold Schwarzenegger in is that the Terminator? I forget which. It's not a tumor. No, I think it was Kindergarten Cop. Arnold Schwarzenegger says it's not a tumor. Thank God most things are not that level. It's just the garbage, it's just dishes. It doesn't mean it's not worthy of a conversation. So everybody's feeling good about it, right? But that's really all it needs to be. And if we can do the suck it up buttercup thing in the first stages of it and just not keep score, it'll be so much better. Okay, that's it. This is Kimberly Quinn signing off from the beautiful, wonderfully snowy Northern Vermont. Have a mindful day.